Hello, hello, and welcome to another edition of Breakdown with the American Legislative Exchange Council. I'm Lars Dalseide, and with me today is Jake Morabito, Task Force Director for the Communications and Technology Task Force. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the FCC. About a month and a half ago, a little bit more than a month ago, they made a ruling when it came to net neutrality that some of the industry are saying it's going to set things way back when it comes to what they're going to be able to deliver to the industries, to the consumers, to the people at large. So first and foremost, Jake, welcome. Thank you for coming on here, walking all the way down the hall and all of that. But give us a brief explanation of what the net neutrality actually means.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me on today, Lars. It's a pleasure to speak on this topic. Now, net neutrality, it's one of those things where you've heard it come and go in the news over the years. It had a lot of attention during the Obama administration and the Trump administration, but it's actually been going back to the early 2000s. We've been having this debate over net neutrality. It was the scholar and Professor Tim Wu who originally coined the phrase. And it initially goes back to this idea of fairness of content delivered on the internet. It's often typified by these three bright line principles that you hear about: no blocking of content, no throttling of content, and no paid prioritization of content. And those all sound like great things. But as is with so often with regulation, the devil is in the details. And essentially the mechanisms for achieving those noble goals is what the problem is, and it would burden regulators and ultimately have a poorer outcome for consumers.
Well, what we've often heard about when it comes to that is, just as you were saying, there's definitely been one side of the political spectrum that believes that they're getting shortchanged when it comes to what's available out there and how some are throttling, holding back their content.
Well, one of the interesting things is a lot of these claims or fears rather, are theoretical. So people worry that internet service providers retain the ability to block websites or throttle, which means reduce the speed of websites. Let's say you're watching a video and they're worried your internet service provider could reduce the traffic without your consent or your knowledge, or with as far as the paid prioritization, offering some sort of a fast lane in order to increase the speed temporarily. A lot of this has not really happened, even when it was repealed under the Trump administration. It's been 6 years since that happened. We haven't seen widespread blocking or throttling or paid prioritization, but the Biden FCC is charging ahead with these strong regulations anyways.
Okay, so it had been working, or at least theoretically it had been working. Some people will argue one way or another. It's like, I'm not seeing the content of so-and-so anymore. But if you're telling me that whatever the numbers were, whatever the stats were, people said that, yes, it's coming out a little bit more equal than it was. Now they say there's a need for a change. What were the changes imposed by the Biden administration?
Sure. So the Biden administration reinstated what's called Title II regulations of the internet. And essentially, it's under the Communications Act of 1934. The FCC dug way back into its authority to use laws that were meant to regulate telephone monopolies in the 1930s. Now, back then, right, you had a cable delivering telephone service. Many people only had one option at the time, or one provider, and there were some legitimate claims of monopoly behavior there. So that's why the FCC has that authority to regulate telephone monopolies back when that was the one choice. Now, flash forward to the 1990s, 2000s, it was in the Telecommunications Act of 1996, it was explicit that the internet would not fall under those strict regimes in order to boost innovation, allow this amazing proliferation of the digital economy. And the proof's in the pudding there. You've seen since the net neutrality regulations were repealed in 2018, broadband prices have gone way down 50%, even without counting for inflation, is down 30%. Internet access is one of the few goods in this environment that actually the price overall has gone down and the quality has gone up, which is amazing. And you have new speeds like 5G, and we'll even be talking about 6G wireless before we know it. So the quality of internet access and products continues to go up. We're investing billions of federal dollars to connect rural America. Meanwhile, the Biden administration wants to slam the telecom industry with regulations, which is the direct opposite result.
Okay, so they're reaching back to I wrote it down, 1934?
Yes.
I got that right.
90 years ago, exactly.
90 years ago. Now, with what are the actual restrictions that they're putting in place thanks to this 90-year-old piece of legislation?
Sure. So, and then another misconception I want to clear up is that you'll hear net neutrality proponents say the internet was unregulated when it was repealed by the Title II regulations were repealed, and that is not true. The Federal Trade Commission, a different agency, retains the ability to enforce consumer protection law. So in these cases where you did have an internet service provider who was discriminating against content, the FTC is still the cop on the beat policing truly unfair conduct. But what Title II does is just grab the FCC unwarranted authority to insert itself even more so in just controlling these broadband networks. And what I think industry fears the most is rate regulation, specifically government mandating certain prices of speeds, which can be problematic, especially as we're trying to connect unserved and underserved areas of the country. And these are businesses, private sector businesses. And if the government is dictating prices, a lot of these private sector actors are either going to fail or just withdraw from the market.
So the federal government is going to, now they say that they can or that they will.
They're pinky promising that they won't, but that statute in the 1934 Act has that in it.
Gives them the power to do that. Well, that in itself should be of great concern. But that's the main thing. So they're trying to control the price. Is that the main thing that the 1934 legislation does? Is more giving the government by some scheme or some sort of price control?
Well, that was what it was attempting to correct, was the telephone monopolies. So here's what ALEC and several allies in the space who promote free markets would suggest, is Congress should actually legislate on the internet itself. I think many people would embrace those common principles of no blocking, no throttling, no unfair discrimination of content. Congress, it's well overdue to codify this. And as I kind of mentioned before, since the early 2000s, we've kind of been ping-ponging back and forth every administration on, for instance, the Biden administration rules are repealing Trump-era rules that repealed Obama-era rules. In other words, every single administration, the rules change on how internet is governed, and it's impossible for private sector businesses, again, who are trying to build infrastructure to make the United States the economic powerhouse of the world.
And are we basically just talking, though, when you're saying the Trump-era rules versus the Obama-era rules versus so we're basically just talking about whatever the executive is going to come out with. There's no actual
and that's because Congress hasn't done anything.
Yes. So why hasn't Congress done anything? What is Congress waiting for?
Balls in Congress's court. I think many people would love for them to step in on this. This is not the only thing that they have not been able to agree upon. We still don't have a federal data privacy standard after well over a decade of talking about that. There's a lot of talk but no action about artificial intelligence as well. So Congress, their tech policy to-do list is growing bigger by the day.
Well, I mean, I can go all the way back into the people here are probably going to laugh because they're kids right now, but I can go back to back when I was in my 20s, which was a long time ago, or even the teens, yeah. And we had AOL, we had the modem going up, we were on the internet, and Congress has done nothing about anything by way of oversight or regulation on that.
There's plenty of existing regulation on the books addressing some of those things I was talking about, like truly anti-competitive behavior or illegal activity. A lot of people like to point to things like Section 230 and say, oh, technology companies have a limitless liability shield, and that's just not true. So I think there's a lot of misconceptions that the internet is this unregulated wild, wild west. And I think as much as possible, it needs to be limited government, not zero government. Some of these bright line principles codified into law will help the telecom industry, but these Title II regulations that are really problematic will actually decrease broadband investment.
Okay, so with this overall ruling by the FCC, in the last week or so, we saw some action from a couple of the different industry groups. Some lawsuits were filed. Mm-hmm. What exactly who was coming after them? What were they saying? What are the claims? What are they hoping to push forward?
So I think 4 different industry associations representing various aspects of the telecommunications industry. That could be the cable providers, the ones who provide fiber wireline access into your house, as well as some of the wireless providers as well, because they're another important part of this equation. They're now filing suit against the FCC, claiming they do not have the authority to institute these regulations. It's a pretty novel interpretation of Title II of the Communications Act of 1934. These companies, I think, would largely argue, and many, like ALEC, would argue they don't have the congressional authorization to dramatically transform the landscape of the internet regulation. And I think it's going to be different this time around. We had litigation since 2010 many times. It was 2010, 2014, I think 2016 this has appeared before the courts. The one thing that's different is the ruling in West Virginia versus EPA that established the major questions doctrine, which dictates that major changes in policy like this require congressional authorization. And especially with Chevron doctrine also coming up for a possible ruling later this term, I think this Supreme Court is going to look look poorly on the FCC for just grabbing this unnecessary regulation. It needs direction and authority from Congress to do that.
Right. And with all of this, you're talking about what they're going to be able to push back and forth right now. And there was the idea of what the prices are going to be. But I guess that most folks, their concern is the speed of, are we going to be able to maintain it? Are we going to get it faster? And of course, are we going to get it cheaper?
Yes, and I just encourage people to look at the data. Don't take my word for it. So you have U.S. Telecom put out their 2023 broadband index, and it shows, and maybe we can put some of these graphics up on the screen and post, but speeds have gone up triple digits, and speeds have increased over the years. You've had, again, prices plummeting at the same time, so you're getting more speed for less dollars.
Even in the rural parts of America?
Well, just on aggregate. And again, the administration has been, I believe in the past decades, certainly nearly $100 billion has been invested in connecting rural America. Just in the past, since 2020, we had with the BEAD program, as it's referred to, $40+ billion being advocated to connect rural America and make sure that every household that wants internet access is connected. So we are addressing that issue, but that's part of the issue and that will bring high-speed broadband internet as it's defined by the FCC to a lot of these unconnected places. But at the same time, if you're just making it difficult for these people to set up shop, then how are we going to connect America? And some are asking the government to step in and operate these government-owned networks that have a terrible track record, where essentially if you're offloading either municipalities or states to run these networks, oftentimes they go out of business in less than a decade, and then all of a sudden the taxpayer's on the hook for this system that now is broken or is not being operated and is sold for pennies on the dollar.
Right. Well, you have all of this moving through. You have, as you said, 4 different lawsuits that are being filed right now. We know those things take forever. They can be years, if not decades, in the courts. So what are we actually hoping for in the short term, in the immediate or the more immediate future?
I would say in the short term, Congress, let's clear this up. Let's pass some legislation on this. It's high time that we end this constant back and forth and have some clear rules. I think if properly channeled, this could be the final tranche of money that it's been promised that over and over, every time Congress appropriates these monies, that this will finally be the time that we get this done. I think you could. But again, as with some of these strict regulations or some of the Biden administration policies calling for mandatory use of organized labor, or again, some of this preference for fiber networks versus some of the wireless options, you have things like fixed wireless access that just wasn't very prevalent in the past 5 years. But now you can have cell towers deploying fixed wireless signals to connect some of those maybe mountainous or other areas where fiber wasn't the right solution. Yeah. We need to be exploring a technologically neutral approach, especially you have services like Starlink, satellite internet increasingly proliferating. So we need to make these kind of bright line principles, but allow innovators the room to grow and increase competition and quality of services for consumers.
Yeah, well, if there's one thing you can count on, is to make sure that government will get in the way. All right, well, that is Jake Morabito, the Task Force Director for our Communications and Technology Task Force here at the American Legislative Exchange Council. And I hope you come back and listen to more soon on Breakdown.